History as it happens, January 25th, 2022. When America built big things.
There is no limit to what our people think we can do, and there is no limit to what our nation can do. And there is no one thing that I know more than this. It's never, ever been a good bet to bet against the American people. Never, never, never.
President Biden invoked the country's history of building great big projects when signing a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. And he pointed out our many needs: roads, bridges, rail lines, water pipes, levees, you name it. There was a time when America built massive projects befitting a modern nation, from the Erie Canal to the interstate highways, projects whose benefits are undeniable but left complicated legacies. What's next for U.S. infrastructure? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So my message to the American people is this: America's moving again, and your life is going to change for the better.
Mega projects sometimes get a bit of a bad name because the ones that we tend to remember most are the ones that weren't successful.
Imagine what it was like trying to travel around the United States by car before the interstate highway system. Well, depending on how old you are, you can ask your parents or grandparents, and they'll tell you it was not easy. And they might even remember films like this one from 1954, Go for the Highway.
State highways, networking the nation. And here's the crisis. 2/3 of the way is now obsolete, worn out, inadequate in width, inferior in condition.
2 years later, Congress passed and President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. And today there are 47,000 miles of interstate highways crisscrossing the country. Maintaining them is an enormous expense. As our guest today wrote in a Bloomberg opinion piece, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which President Biden signed into law in November, is no New Deal. Its $550 billion in new infrastructure spending will be more about rehabilitating what we have than building more.
The U.S. just has so much of it. And the cost of maintaining what's already there is enormous. You know, you look at a city like New York. New York hit that point much earlier because it was a huge city long ago. You know, already by the 50s and 60s, certainly the 70s, a lot of this infrastructure built in the 19th century, early 20th century, was starting to fall apart.
Our conversation with transportation historian Jonathan English is coming up in a moment. We're going to look back, really all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, when the first highways were built. Those early 19th century highways were canals, of course. And we're going to look ahead to our infrastructure challenges and try to answer why the U.S. no longer thinks big, builds big any longer. For the most part, anyway. There are some big projects in the works, like the $12.3 billion Gateway Tunnel project to fix the tunnels under the Hudson River connecting New Jersey to New York City, tunnels built a century ago. Construction has yet to begin, and it will take years to complete. The U.S. still has no high-speed rail. We haven't built a new major airport since the 1990s. Parts of the country lack high-speed broadband, and also missing is a national consensus on what to build and how much to spend. President Biden's bill may be a good start, but it's not nearly enough. Jonathan English is an expert on infrastructure history, and he is a fellow at the Marin Institute of Urban Management at New York University and director of policy at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Jonathan English, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we begin, well, at the beginning, the 19th century, and the notion that the United States as a nation needed to develop national plans instead of just leaving it up to the individual states to have what were called national improvements, roads and canals. But at that time, this idea was controversial because of the debate over the constitutionality of national improvements. President Madison wound up vetoing a bill that was proposed by John C. Calhoun, of all people. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think sort of broadly speaking, it's always a challenge in a country like the United States, which has, firstly, a federal system. It used to be certainly a much looser federal system. And, there's always been this challenge between the states, which tend to take a primary role in these sorts of things. And the reality that the United States, of course, is a single economic unit. If you look at our cities, for example, so many big American cities sprawl over 2 or 3, maybe even you could say 4 states. Evidently, commuters every day commute from New Hampshire to Boston, from Connecticut to New York, or Jersey to New York.
And we have super commuters here from the distant parts of Virginia or Maryland coming into D.C.
Even West Virginia,
Yes.
so I hear. The challenge is you need a transportation infrastructure, or infrastructure more broadly, that can bring people, bring resources to port for overseas export. A bit later on, bring water for drinking and irrigation. In the American Southwest, this came largely a little bit later. One of the challenges always is balancing that interest between local governance and the need for interstate or even a national view on how these networks need to be built out.
That's right. And infrastructure, of course, is more than just roads and bridges. It's ports, airports, of course, now. There were no airports last time I checked during John C. Calhoun's time, but also levees and dams and canals. So John C. Calhoun, before he became an ardent sectionalist, a champion of the South, he was a nationalist. He had this bonus bill that President Madison vetoed because he believed it wasn't constitutional to have the federal government pay for these things. So it then defaulted to the states, right? And it was New York that took on the Erie Canal project.
That's right. And New York wasn't alone. There were other states as well that launched canal projects. Pennsylvania did as well. And the big challenge of the United States in the 19th century was you had this enormous territory in Midwest, west of the Appalachians, that was very fertile, lots of great agricultural land, but it was really difficult to get from there to the East Coast. In some ways, the most logical route was through Canada, but that was obviously a foreign country. It's relatively flat up the St. Lawrence, Niagara Falls aside. But if you want to go to the East Coast of the United States, you have to cross this mountain range. And while it's not the Rockies, it's still a challenge. And it certainly was a challenge in the 19th century. And the easiest way to move large quantities of goods before we had the railway was by canal. And there were all kinds of these canal projects that were built, right across the United States. Basically, every state that had a big port along the East Coast, they wanted their own canal to get to the West, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to compete with the other port that did have a direct route. In New York's case, they wanted to build a canal to the Great Lakes just upstream from Niagara Falls so that you can more or less make your way all the way through to Superior and Chicago.
Moving anything over land in those days was pretty impossible.
Incredibly hard. Yeah, incredibly hard.
And expensive. The parallel to today is, we all see that there's a need to build things for the benefit of the country, but it's still controversial. In the 19th century, if we can stick with the Erie Canal, not everyone wanted to do this. It was a huge undertaking, an engineering marvel, and it took quite a bit of time.
Well, that's the thing about these. Mega projects sometimes get a bit of a bad name because the ones that we tend to remember most are the ones that weren't successful. They sort of always remain a project, whereas the mega projects that are successful are just so intrinsic to the fabric of our lives that you forget that they're even there. The Erie Canal obviously isn't used for commercial freight anymore, but it certainly was integral to the development of New York State and the city of New York as a major port in the later years as well. The city of New York could only have developed as a major city. The Hudson River is salty. It's basically like the ocean. You can't drink it. So New York could only have developed as a major city if it had a source of water from further north in New York State that was potable. And so they built over time incredible infrastructure, the first one in the 19th century, to bring water down into New York City. The same thing is true of other parts of the country as well.
So the way the United States did infrastructure and big projects changed dramatically with the New Deal. Why is that? What happened there?
Well, I think firstly, there was this acceptance of a broader direct government role. Certainly the government built some big infrastructure projects.
It wasn't zero before this.
No, it absolutely wasn't. But they tended to be what we would now call public-private partnerships. So, you think of the Transcontinental Railroad. Those were private companies that built that, albeit with enormous government assistance. The same thing was true of canals, of the more local railroads, and even some of the water projects. One of the companies that was originally founded to build water infrastructure to New York was the Manhattan Company, which then decided it was more lucrative to be a bank. Up through the chain, eventually became Chase Manhattan. Around the time of the New Deal, and this wasn't just a federal phenomenon, but there was a greater belief in direct government planning and direct government operation of major infrastructure projects. So we saw public takeovers, and this was happening already in the 1920s when transit companies, for example, were suffering from inflation. Inflation had been quite low before the First World War, and it exploded. They were hit very hard, and the response was, in many cases, a government takeover of these businesses to keep them running, expand them, et cetera. This was true in other places as well. The Bureau of Reclamation was created, a little bit before the New Deal originally, but really expanded.
Was there also a sense that because of the Great Depression, the need to mobilize the country and get our resources moving again? Yeah,
there were two top-tier objectives for infrastructure in the New Deal period. One was to just get people working. It was a proto-Keynesian approach to creating jobs to get the economy going. The second was there had long been parts of the country that were poorer and less developed industrially and economically. Parts of the West and parts of the South, in particular, parts of Appalachia as well.
Why don't we remind our listeners, I'll let you remind them, the state of the country in the early 20th century. New York is one thing, but weren't there still large swaths of the country that didn't have electricity or any type of real road system?
Exactly. If you just wanted to go to the doctor, it was a real journey. You take places like Arizona and Nevada, the populations were tiny. Why? Because there was no water. It was a very challenging place to live. Once water was added, and actually electricity, by the Bureau of Reclamation's Hoover Dam project and other projects, much later the Central Arizona project, these areas were able to become the boom areas of the latter part of the 20th century, along with air conditioning, which was a big help.
Yeah. Dams were a big part of the New Deal, is what you're saying.
A humongous part, yeah.
How about highways? We're going to get to the interstate highways in 1956 and beyond, but what about roadways with the New Deal?
So there was highway investment, but it wasn't quite as big a part of the New Deal as it became later. There were actually a lot of what you could call tourist highways, scenic highways that were built by the New Deal, again, with the idea of developing the parts of the country like Appalachia that are beautiful, but not necessarily wealthy. So, you can drive the Blue Ridge Parkway, give some tourism business to the communities along there, and building those projects also gave jobs to people. So that was real and significant. Housing was actually another big one. The New Deal, especially in New York, but other places as well, did fund the first public housing projects that took off a little bit after that.
And electrification, which I guess goes with the dam construction.
Yes, for sure. The TVA in the South was obviously huge for that. Started with dams, but then they built a lot of other types of power plants, and they're still the major electricity supplier in a big part of the South.
I remember reading one of Robert Caro's books about LBJ, and that part of Texas had no electricity. So would you say the New Deal then was a watershed moment? From this point on, the federal government would take a central role in planning, paying for, and building the infrastructure improvements a modern country would need?
That's exactly right. And to build on that, the federal government took a national, or at the very least regional, multi-state approach to the types of infrastructure that they built, unsurprisingly. These dam projects weren't just for one town. It was for the whole Missouri River, the whole Colorado River. These electrification projects, it was for whole regions of the country. So these were projects that were large, but they were also so grand in scale. They weren't just big projects, generally speaking. Of course, there were local projects as well, and small ones as well. But the big picture was intended to be a very national scope.
So I've driven cross-country twice, not for pleasure. I was moving, relocating for jobs many, many years ago. It's a beautiful country if you haven't done it. We take for granted the ability to do that easily. Prior to the creation of the interstate highway system, which was an Eisenhower program starting in 1956, of course it took a long time to complete, what was the state of major roadways to move around the country
So my grandparents used to go to Florida for a couple of weeks every winter because, it's cold. And they would always drive down. And when I was a kid, I was fascinated by their maps because they had kept some of the old maps from when they first did the journey. And back then, I-75 was not built. At least a lot of it was not built. And so, you would be driving along these roads that every few miles you're going through the downtown of some small town. It's one thing if you're going a couple hundred miles, it's going to take you a while. But if you're going 1,000 or 2,000 miles, I mean, truly, it's going to take you forever to get anywhere. And sort of famously, one of the stories that was Eisenhower, one of the missions he was sent on before the war was to command a convoy, which was sent to drive across the country. And it was horrible. And that put in him a sense of urgency about, look, this isn't just an economic problem. It's also a military, strategic, and national security problem. That this is an enormous country. If there was a crisis or whatever, it would take a very long time to get across. And then when he was commanding the occupying forces in Germany, he saw the Autobahn. And there had been a few roads like that built in the United States already, but he saw those roads and saw how useful they could be.
I imagine it was easy to get lost, too, in those days. Eisenhower, you mentioned it was an issue of commerce, national security. How did the states initially view the new highway system coming online for interstate commerce or travel within their own borders?
Well, so the Interstate Highway Program, big picture, of course, the states loved the idea of basically free money. They only had to put up 10% of the cost of all these big highway projects that got designated interstate and had an I put in front of them. So for them, this was a bit of a bonanza. The thing is that the states saw their primary need for transport and travel to be much more local. The vast majority of trips ultimately are local trips.
That's right.
Your trip to work or whatever. So a lot of the money that went for these nominally interstate highways was actually spent on roads to get people from the newly growing suburbs to the downtown.
We've been talking about the benefits of all these projects. They're undeniable. But there were problems, of course, with how dams, highways, etc. were built. Environmental justice, racial justice concerns were shunted aside. I also remember Robert Caro describing what the Cross Bronx Expressway did to neighborhoods in the Bronx. So why did this large-scale approach to infrastructure planning cause so many terrible, long-lasting problems?
It's a phenomenon of exactly what I was saying before, that these projects or these networks were planned on a national scale, or at the very least, a regional scale. We said, okay, well, we need to get people from here to here. And by definition, most of these things, transportation infrastructure is linear infrastructure. A road is useless if there's a gap in the middle of it. So you have to somehow find a way to get that road from point A to point B. And what happens to be in the middle of it is something to be overcome. Dams, obviously, it's a little bit different, but a dam by definition raises the water level. So whatever is behind the dam, some of it is now going to be underwater. One of the stories that had to get cut for length from the article, I love this. There's a series of dams I mentioned New York City's water supply. There's a series of dams and reservoirs that were built, and they flooded a number of towns further upstate in New York. So those towns are now sitting at the bottom of a reservoir. One of those towns, you can't make this up, is actually called Never Sink.
Amazing. I didn't know that.
It's at the bottom of a reservoir. But, roads as well.
Destroying neighborhoods, basically.
Yeah, are the most obvious one. An expressway requires an enormously wide right-of-way. Subways could be built underground, elevated trains over the street. They might be unattractive, but a highway is a big, wide thing that you have to punch through cities that had been built around walking and transit. So they were pretty high density places, relatively speaking. And, when you drew these big lines, the way that somebody like Robert Moses, but Harlem, Bartholomew, and there's any number of equivalents in other cities who didn't have Robert Caro to write about them. They drew these big lines, and what was in the middle got knocked down. And there are lots of people who have shown that these areas disproportionately singled out low income and minority communities because they lacked the political power to fight back. Georgetown was a good example. In Washington, there had been a plan for an expressway through Georgetown, and the people who lived in Georgetown, who had a fair bit of pull, sort of made some phone calls.
Yeah.
And strangely, that highway project disappeared from the plan.
But urban areas did improve their ability to fight these destructive highway projects over time.
Yeah, they certainly did. I think people saw how much damage these projects were doing. And I think they got linked with the challenges that cities were facing more broadly at the time. Also, you look at an aerial photo of an American city in 1945 and an American city in 1960, 65, the downtowns were flattened. Block after block after block was wiped out for parking lots. Why? Because you had all these highways bringing people into the city, but nowhere for them to park. When you read documents from the 50s, the crisis is actually not highway congestion so much, it's lack of parking.
Yeah. Well, parking lots are dead zones in cities.
I was going to say, you end up with these cities where you've got skyscrapers and parking lots. And a lot of downtowns more or less still look like that.
I went to Detroit a few summers ago, and I noticed that there. Of course, Detroit is trying to overcome that. And that debate is going on today about transit-oriented development and more livable, walkable cities. Your conclusion in your piece was that era is over, though. We're built out.
Look, are there still some cases of highways being planned or built, even in urban areas? Absolutely, they do exist. But broadly speaking, you can't compare. Just look at a map of highways in a city like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or Atlanta. All of those highways were built basically just about, New York was a bit earlier, but just about between sort of the mid 50s to the early 80s, more or less.
Yeah.
That's not a very long period. And since then, most of these cities have had virtually no new highways because there isn't the tolerance for the kind of eminent domain that you have to do to just flatten block after block after block of houses, which was done routinely in the 50s and 60s. So that era is over. But even projects that are meant to be more environmentally or even improve the impact of a highway, like putting the highway in a tunnel or covering it with a park or whatever, even those projects are controversial and frequently get defeated.
Why, as a nation, don't we think big about infrastructure any longer?
Well, I think that there are three things. One, the U.S. just has so much of it. And the cost of maintaining what's already there is enormous. You look at a city like New York. New York hit that point much earlier because it was a huge city long ago. Already by the 50s and 60s, certainly the 70s, a lot of this infrastructure built in the 19th century, early 20th century was starting to fall apart. It has a natural lifespan. And New York was really struggling to kind of fix it up. California, on the other hand, everyone was, this is the place of the future. Everything is shiny and new and exciting. And sure enough, when infrastructure is brand new, it doesn't cost that much to maintain it. But now California is in the same boat New York was back in the 70s. Everything is 50, 60 years old and is starting to fall apart. So they're really struggling to maintain what they have. The second problem is the sheer cost of building in the United States. When you compare the United States to places overseas, and this is something I've worked on a little bit, and my colleagues at NARIN at NYU are leaders in this, the cost is very, very high. You compare the United States to a place like France or Spain. Spain is sort of the world leader for a lot of this stuff.
Well, why is that? Because those places have high labor costs, too.
Yeah, I've heard people say, they don't have any unions. And it's like a French person would be very surprised to hear that.
So many major projects go over budget or over schedule. But there are so many, even if they don't go over budget, they're still prohibitively expensive.
Well, so that's the key thing. I think one of the big problems is that it's always a scandal when a project is over budget. It's never a scandal, or rarely, when it's just really expensive from the beginning, because you sort of assume that that's just what it costs. So there is an incentive there to inflate the initial budget.
Interesting.
Because then you don't have to worry as much about going over budget. I don't think that's the key issue. I think part of it is experience. Look, the United States in 1973 was incredibly good at building highways. Why were they incredibly good at building highways? Because they've been building thousands of miles of them for the previous 25 years. The United States has not been building thousands of miles of highways today. And the same is true of subways, of mainline railways, whatever, you name it.
Yeah, we're not building many subways in the United States. L.A. is.
L.A. is. And
there's only so many places where a subway would work. But still,
for sure,
light rail, streetcar projects, high-speed, long-distance rail. When you look at the cost per mile, it's ridiculous. And only the federal government can afford to pay for those things. States have trouble especially if they don't want to raise taxes.
And federal funding has shaped transportation policy, for example, for a very long time. And
mostly goes to roads.
It does, but a lot does go to transit. I mean, you see these light rail lines popping up in every major city across the country. And I think one problem is that for various reasons that, I mean, I can get into, there is a real capital bias. You know, they fund capital expenses, but not operating expenses. So you have cities building projects that there isn't the money to then continue operating a frequent service or a surrounding network to bring people to the rail line. You know, you end up with situations where you have a rail line that cost a few billion, mostly federal dollars, but you're not spending the few $1 million a year that you would need to actually run that train frequently or run the buses that bring people to that train frequently.
When it comes to transportation, it's not just a national thing. It is a local issue. And that's one reason why members of Congress who say live in a rural state where they just have highways and no need for mass transit aren't maybe keen on spending federal dollars to fund a mass transit project in a state on the other side of the country. I mean, here in D.C., the federal government paid for the construction of the D.C. Metro. To think of something like that happening today, I mean, that probably would not happen.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't, although the federal government does fund light rail projects and projects like that.
They do grants and loans, not necessarily direct appropriation.
Not to the same extent. And I mean, I will say, you know, Washington is special for obvious reasons. So it's not every city that did get that. But, you know, there was a big push sort of as part of the, you know, the way the Great Society was trying to build on the New Deal. There was a push to make transit, urban transit, a big part of the spending of the Great Society. Cities were a big focus of that period, and urban transit was seen to be as a bit of a reaction to the spending on highways of the 1950s, which the whole Great Society was responding to some extent. And when we talk about mega projects fading into the background, nothing fades into the background more than water. You know, you turn on the tap and you think that water just happens to be there. But almost any city that you live in, there's some, unless you live on a big lake, there's some elaborate means to get you that water, whether it's a dam or an aqueduct. California couldn't exist as it does today without a huge number of state and federally funded water projects that bring water from Northern California to Southern California, or from the Colorado River to Southern California. You know, we tend to think of these as primarily urban, but most of the water, the large majority of the water, is actually consumed by agriculture. And,
wow, well, that's a good point.
And California is literally the most productive agricultural region on the planet. And it's almost entirely on water that comes from these projects that were built.
But I mentioned before how many of these projects are local, but we also have to keep in mind the issue of global competitiveness, right? China, which doesn't observe the same type of environmental regulations as the United States, builds hundreds and hundreds of miles of high-speed rail. Other countries, Europe, high-speed rail and subways. Why is high-speed rail so difficult in the United States? Beyond the cost, unless maybe cost is the issue.
I mean, I think first and foremost, cost is the issue. Projects in the United States routinely cost 5 times what they would cost in, say, France or Spain.
That's crazy.
And when you're talking about that, you know, the United States is a rich country, but it's not that rich. It's not 5 times richer than France or Spain. So this is a big problem. There are various reasons for that. One is the expertise. One is that these countries, generally speaking, in Europe, for example, have a strong existing rail network.
And culturally, too, they're a rail culture more than the United States.
They are. Yeah, they are. And I think that there's also an element of an American desire to reinvent the wheel. You know, when you have a technology that already exists and is proven and successful, it has to be kind of reinvented or Americanized or whatever, and you end up spending 10 times as much on it. And, you know, Buy America does play a role in this. But there are also other elements that are legitimate, which are that the United States just has much more suburbia. So the way that they built the TGV in France, it uses a traditional rail line to get to the edge of Paris. And then it shoots off onto a new line once you're out in the countryside. And it's much cheaper building in farm fields than it is in an urban area. The problem is the distance from the center of a big American city to the edge is much, much longer than it is in Paris, even though Paris is an enormous city. That is an issue, especially in the Northeast. It's much less of an issue in California. Once you get out of LA, the population is lower than anywhere in Europe.
Well, the high-speed rail issue, too, you need to find, say, 2 cities that are too far to drive too close to fly?
More or less. High-speed rail can compete quite well with air on the kinds of flights that would be sort of like an hour. So up to 500 miles, I would say high-speed rail can be very, very, very competitive.
Because I'd rather take a train than have to deal with an airport, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
One point you made in your piece that I thought was right on the money, and it's been irking me because we're supposed to be living in a great wealthy nation. You point out how difficult it can be to travel long distances in the United States. Do you want to have to drive on traffic-clogged and potentially dangerous highways with the way people drive, or deal with packed airports? Although now, of course, with the pandemic, that's not a problem. Post-pandemic, if there is a post-pandemic, that shouldn't be the case in our country.
No, and it really shouldn't. This is actually where, when you talk about rail, for example, this is where that national planning in a way hurts, because France or Germany or Spain, the country is perfectly sized for high-speed rail. To go from the middle to the edge of the country is maybe 500 miles. That's not true in the United States. And the reality is that it is never going to be realistic for people to take a high-speed train from Denver to LA or something like that. The distance is just too long.
Yeah.
There's way too little population in between. There are some places in the United States where high-speed rail would work brilliantly, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in parts of the Southeast, in California, in the Pacific Northwest, and a few other places. But these are necessarily regional projects, not national ones. And that's challenging for a federal government to say, okay, you, New York, you, California, you, Texas, get money, but you, Wyoming, you, New Mexico, you, whatever, Nevada, don't.
And we should probably point out what we mean by high-speed rail, not the Amtrak Acela, which only hits its top speed for a relatively short stretch of track because of all the turns in the track, because of the right-of-way. We're talking about 180, 200 miles an hour at least is high-speed rail. And in the Northeast Corridor, it would be great to have something like that where you can go from New York to Washington in an hour or so. I know there are plans for a maglev that will probably, that's the magnetic levitation train that they have in Japan that goes, 300 and something miles an hour. Yeah. So your main argument is the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill is really not a big deal. I think that's spaced out over, 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. And most of it's going to get soaked up by just maintaining the roads that we already have, the highways we already have. Where should we be going with infrastructure here in the 21st century, Jonathan English? High-speed internet for the entire country? What are some other forms of infrastructure that we're really not getting to that we need?
I think that there are a few different things. High-speed internet, I think, is actually a critical one. And I think the parallels between that and rural electrification, which was kind of the big thing of the New Deal, are huge. There are large parts of the country that don't have this technology, like electricity, maybe not quite to the same importance, but it's very important. And that cuts them off from a lot of their economic potential. And so that's a big one. I do think we need to figure out a way to move people in and between cities. Cities are growing, right? Not everyone, but most cities are growing. And the problem is that most of them have not added any transportation infrastructure in decades. And eventually, you're going to run out of space on the stuff that was built in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. So that we have to figure out a way that we can add transportation infrastructure and at a cost that is reasonable. So, whether that's something like a higher speed commuter rail to allow people to travel longer distances to get into cities, just improving local transit service so you can actually get to and from the train. Those kinds of things are also going to be critical. Air travel, again, we don't know what the immediate future of air travel is, but so many airports across the country are very congested. One of the things that the FAA has been trying to do is upgrade the air traffic control system to be much more modern.
And what are we waiting for, the 23rd century to do these things?
Yeah.
And when was the last time we built an airport in the United States? I guess the new one in New York City.
Well, no. The problem is terminals are nice. New terminals are nice. They look nice and they make the experience nicer than for the passenger, but they don't actually allow you to move more people, generally speaking. The constraint at an airport is runways. And building new runways is much, much more difficult. The last new airport in the U.S. was Denver.
What year was that, roughly?
In the 90s.
That's 30 years ago.
New runways do get built, but again, only in some regions of the country. And sadly, in some places in areas that don't need them that badly. St. Louis built a new runway and then they lost their hub the next year. Now the runway's barely used. Meanwhile, New York would kill for a new runway, but it would be incredibly complex to build.
Well, I lied. One more question. A big aspect of this is getting the money to pay for these things. The gas tax has not been increased. We're talking about the federal gas tax. States have increased their own gas taxes. The federal gas tax hasn't been increased since 1993 when Bill Clinton was the president. It doesn't seem like there's any chance for a gas tax hike now. A president or Congress that says, yes, we want you to pay more for gasoline in this climate. I don't think that's going to happen.
I mean, I think that there was a really good principle with the gas tax originally, which was that you drive on the road and you pay for it. The interstate highways, other than some grandfathered in, are not toll roads. You pay for it when you fill your car up with gas. It's a fairly fair system and less complicated to administer than putting a toll on every road. But we've kind of detached it from that, partly by using the gas tax for other things, and then partly by not increasing it so that it's not covering the full cost of roads. So part of the problem is that maintenance is far less exciting than a new road or a widening or whatever. But I think if people saw the direct positive impact, if people said, okay, I'm going to pay 2 cents more a gallon or 5 cents more a gallon or whatever at the pump, but now there's going to be a new lane or something or a new road or whatever. I think it would be a much easier sell for them, even a new commuter train potentially, so they don't have to drive.
Bring back congressional earmarks.
Well, you know what? That's the thing, right? Like there were some earmarks that very justifiably got a bad name, but some of them, they kind of funded a lot of the big infrastructure that we rely on.
Jonathan English, let us hope we get our act together. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Great Inflation is bringing back 1970s nightmares.
It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation.
Investors are panicking on Wall Street. On Main Street, ordinary Americans are paying more for almost everything. How did we get here? We'll be joined by Thomas Honig, former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, who's been warning the country about inflation for years. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.